Hey guys, tonight we begin with something sunburnt, sleepless, and completely overrated: daily survival in ancient Greece. Not the marble columns, not the statues, not the philosophically toned abs of mythical heroes. Just the sweat, the goats, the lice, and the constant state of physical discomfort they don't show in textbooks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's listening while curled up in bed at 3 versus someone stuck on a bus at sunrise. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up drenched in sweat, not because the day has begun, but because the air inside your house has stopped bothering to pretend it's breathable. The walls around you are made of sun-dried mud bricks, which is ancient Greek for "these will bake you alive by breakfast and freeze you solid by dinner." There is no ceiling insulation, no window glass, just a crooked shutter creaking in protest as the early morning sun bullies its way into the room. You're lying on a mat stuffed with straw that's seen better centuries, wearing a tunic that smells like sour wine, goat breath, and human resignation. There's no pillow, unless you count your arm, and even it's gone numb. The family goat is snoring somewhere near your feet, and you're fairly certain you just heard your father mumble something angry in his sleep about figs and taxation. This is not a peaceful dawn. This is heat stroke with sound effects. There's no such thing as privacy. You sleep, snore, sweat, and slowly unravel your sense of dignity within arm's reach of everyone else you know. Your mother, your siblings, your cousins, and at least one neighbor who never technically leaves are all arranged like meat in a storage cellar, pressed together on mats, cloaks, and what might be a pile of firewood someone gave up on. The room smells like boiled grain, foot skin, wet wool, and last night's philosophical argument turned violent. Personal space is a myth. If you shift too loudly, someone will kick you. If you breathe with too much ambition, the goat will glare. You try to stand, and your joints protest with the sound of collapsing pottery. Your knees ache. Your shoulders feel like they've been used to grind flour in your sleep. The lice that live in your hair have had a productive night. Your back is moist. Your cloak is damp. The heat sits on your chest like guilt, and you haven't even made it to the door. You scrape yourself off the mat, peel your tunic from the places it fused to your skin, and step toward the crooked threshold of your home like a condemned man walking to trial. Outside, the first wave of sunlight hits your face with the full force of passive-aggressive weather. You blink into the brightness and immediately regret it. The air smells like fish, dung, dust, and sweat. The four elements of early civilization. Someone is already shouting about bread. Someone else is spitting in the street. A child is screaming about a chicken. It's unclear who the chicken belongs to or whether the child is winning. You shuffle forward. Hunched, blinking, your feet bare and your soul unprepared. There is no bathroom. There is a designated pit somewhere behind the house, or a field, or a quiet place near the edge of town where shame goes to die. If you're lucky, no one else is using it. If you're unlucky, you become part of someone else's cautionary tale. You splash your face with water from a cracked basin and call a hygiene. The water is warm and tastes faintly of pottery and compromise. You spit. You wipe your mouth with your sleeve. The goat has followed you. You are now officially awake. You haven't eaten yet, but your body already feels like it's been awake for a decade. Every joint clicks. Every muscle is suspicious. Your lower back has filed a formal complaint against gravity, and your stomach, ever the optimist, assumes you might feed it something this side of edible. That's adorable, because what awaits you isn't nourishment. It's maza, the culinary equivalent of being disappointed by bread. Imagine mixing barley flour with water, shaping it into a disc, leaving it in ashes overnight, and then asking yourself if joy ever really existed. That's breakfast. You sit by the low slab of wood that functions as a table, if only by consensus. There are no plates, no chairs, no spoons, forks, or even an encouraging nod from the gods. Just stale mazza, a shallow cup of watered-down wine, and a buzzing cloud of flies who seem to enjoy it far more than you do. The bread is hard, not crunchy hard, not toasty hard. This is structural hard. This is break a tooth, chip a molar, file for compensation hard. You gnaw on it like a desperate beaver trying to impress Zeus and realize, halfway through the second bite, that the flies might be onto something. They at least know how to digest this. You dip it in wine to soften it, which helps exactly as much as dabbing vinegar on a papyrus fire. The wine is thin, sour, and not even slightly comforting. It tastes like grapes dyed in vain. The water mixed into it is just clean enough not to kill you on contact, but not trustworthy enough to sip without flinching. Still, it's all you've got, and it's not like your stomach is currently in a position to negotiate. You chew, you swallow, you contemplate mortality. This is the highlight of your nutritional day. If you're lucky, someone might toss a handful of olives your way. If you're exceptionally lucky, one of them isn't already half eaten by something with legs. Cheese is mythical. Fruit is rare. Honey? A joke, eggs? Not for you. Your breakfast is a testament to the triumph of survival over flavor. Ancient Greece, for all its intellectual wonders, has no patience for morning indulgence. Food isn't pleasure. It's preemptive damage control. You eat to delay collapse. That's it. And let's not forget the social part. If you're a man, you eat now. If you're a woman, you wait. If you're a child, you eat later. If you're a slave, you eat when someone else forgets to finish their portion or dies suddenly. Meals are hierarchical, joyless, and brief. There's no chatting, no bonding, no good morning. There's chewing, occasionally spitting, and a low hum of existential discomfort. If someone speaks, it's probably to complain that the goat got into the barley again, or to curse the potter who sold them this bowl-shaped insult to pottery. And when you're done, if done, means your jaw has given up and your stomach is filled with concrete sorrow, you wipe your mouth with your hand on your tunic, and your tunic on whatever's closest. Napkins aren't real. Dignity is optional. You stand, burp something between apology and defiance, and step back into the rising heat of a sun that is not, for 1 second, stop trying to kill you. You're full now, or at least no longer actively starving, which is good, because it's time to get dressed and confront the outside world. A world that's dusty, judgmental, and more than willing to pretend your personal shame is entertainment. Your clothing options are limited to 2 oversized rectangles of cloth, and both of them hate you. The chiton and the himation are not garments so much as elaborate fabric puzzles held together by strategic folds, small metal pins, and sheer optimism. There's no tailoring. There's no stitching. There's certainly no sizing. What you wear is what you have, and what you have is something that looks like it was designed by a committee of drunk philosophers with a vendetta against modesty. You throw the linen over your shoulder, wrap it under one arm, twist it across your chest, tie it with something that used to be a belt, and stab a pin through the whole mess, praying to every minor household deity that it doesn't come undone the next time you sneeze. There are no buttons, no zippers, just friction and desperation. The fabric is unwashed. It smells like 5 consecutive summers. It has stains you don't remember earning. It's scratchy, stiff in the wrong places and suspiciously moist in the others, but it's the only thing between you and a very breezy public scandal, so you make it work. There is no underwear. That's not an omission. It's a worldview. The idea that you might want to layer between your vulnerable bits in the world is considered laughable, even decadent. Bras are non-existent. Liners? Never heard of them. You move carefully. You sit even more carefully. You live in constant awareness that one poorly timed gust of wind could reveal your entire philosophical outlook to the neighborhood. And the wind in Greece is not subtle. It's the kind of dry, aggressive breeze that feels like it's working for the gods directly. If it wants to expose you, it will. You reach for your sandals, assuming you have them. They're handmade from rough leather straps and the faint memory of comfort. No cushioning. No arch support. Just thin, hardened soles tied to your feet with knotted cords that once had structure and now have personality. They're cracked, warped by heat and time, and perpetually full of sand no matter how far you are from the coast. You slip them on and instantly remember every blister you've ever earned on the sun-baked roads of your village. If you're poor, and let's not pretend you're not, you might not have sandals at all. Barefoot is a lifestyle choice forced upon you by generational economics and goat-related mishaps. And speaking of roads, they're not roads the way you think of them. They're trails of stone and trampled dirt, littered with animal droppings, discarded bones, bits of broken pottery, and the shattered ambitions of merchants who thought figs would sell better than olives this week. You step outside and immediately regret it. The ground is hot enough to fry the concept of mercy. The dust coats your feet within seconds. Your legs feel the kind of dry ache reserved for clay statues and people who haven't had water since sunrise. You shield your face from the sun with your hand because hats are for rich people and sunscreen hasn't been invented yet. Your eyes squint against the blinding light reflecting off stone walls, pale dust, and the bare chests of men who have confused daily labor with heroic posing. Your shoulders burn through the fabric within minutes. Your linen sticks to your back like damp paper. It wrinkles in ways that expose you, and folds in ways that chafe. You walk like someone trying to prevent a wardrobe malfunction while dodging donkey dung and eye contact. And this is normal. This is daily. This is your outfit. Your armor, your disguise, your punishment. It clings, it sags, it stinks, and you can't afford another one. So you wear like a badge of survival and pretend it doesn't betray you with every step. You're now fully dressed, or at least covered in the technical sense, and you've managed to stagger through breakfast without choking on your own despair. That means you're ready to face the day, and if you're a man, or more accurately, a male citizen of fighting age, that day might involve holding a spear, marching in a straight line, and silently hoping the guy next to you doesn't drop his shield and cause a regional catastrophe. Because in ancient Greece, military service isn't a job. It's your civic duty, your cultural identity, and the most likely cause of your eventual death. You don't enlist. You exist. And existing as a man means you're automatically part of the military infrastructure, whether you're more philosopher than fighter or just particularly bad at not bleeding. If you live in Athens, you start training in your teens. By the time you're 18, you're shoved into a 2-year program of mandatory physical drills, weapon training, marching practice, and long-winded lectures for men with sandals and deeply traumatized eyes. It's called the ephebic system, which is Greek for we're going to break you down and then complain that you're too soft. You learn to throw spears, hold shields, stab with pointy objects, and survive on rations that make Mazza look decadent. You learn how to stand in formation, how to obey orders, how to scream on command, and how to make your armor not fall off while running uphill into what is almost definitely a trap. In Sparta, it's worse. You start at 7. Yes, 7. They take you from your family and toss you into the agoge, a system designed not so much to educate you as to see if you can survive being starved. Beaten, humiliated, and occasionally hunted for sport. You're taught discipline through pain, loyalty through isolation, and teamwork by being forced to steal food together or get flogged for failing. You're not a child. You're a national investment. Your body belongs to Sparta, and if you're not strong enough to carry a shield by the time your voice changes, there's a good chance they'll decide to stop feeding you out of principle. There is always a war. Athens against Sparta, Sparta against everyone. Athens against Persia, Persia against itself. City-states squabbling over trade routes, goat thefts, and mild insults disguised as poetry. You're either preparing for war, fighting in a war, recovering from war, or arguing about who should start the next war. Peace is not a goal. Peace is the awkward silence between invasions. If you're lucky enough to be born into a relatively calm year, you spend your time drilling, maintaining weapons, practicing formations, and watching your elders argue about military funding in the assembly while wearing robes that don't fully cover their knees. And none of this is free. You supply your own armor. That's right. Being a soldier in Greece is a bring-your-own bronze situation. If you have money, you might afford a bronze helmet, a breastplate, shin guards, a solid spear, and the famous hoplon, a round wooden shield rimmed with bronze and heavy enough to destroy your spine and your will to live. If you're poor, you get leather or nothing. You fight half-armored, hoping the enemy gets tired before they get to you. You are quite literally the expendable end of the phalanx. When you're not marching or training, you might be rowing. The trireme, Greece's pride and floating punishment, is powered by dozens of sweating men jammed shoulder to shoulder in a wooden hull that smells like mildew and other men. You row for hours through waves, wind, and enemy fire, powered by shouted commands, bad food, and the fear of drowning beneath a glorified canoe. If you're seasick, tough. If you're sunburnt, tougher. If you die, there's a short poem and a slightly longer sigh. There's no retirement plan, no veterans care, no pension. If you're wounded, you either recover or don't. If you're traumatized, you talk to a statue or drink about it. If you lose a limb, you become part of the city's scenery, a walking reminder that citizenship comes with teeth and no safety net. And no one calls it unfair. They call it honorable. You, a man with dust in your sandals and cramps in your thighs, may now return home from your drills, your rowing bench, or your civic duty to bleed publicly. But if you happen to be a woman, none of that applies because you're not going anywhere. You don't row, you don't march, you don't vote, and you certainly don't exist in public unless someone with testicles walked beside you like a human permission slip. Being a woman in ancient Greece isn't just about domestic life. It's about legal. Invisibility wrapped in linen and silence. You are not a citizen. You are not a participant. You are not a voice in the great democracy of thinkers and orators. You are a womb with chores. Your morning starts earlier than the men's because the oven house doesn't run itself. You rise before dawn, grind grain, fetch water, spin wool, sweep the floor, feed the goat, maybe the baby, and maybe both at once. You knead dough with hands that already hurt from weaving all night. You scrub the same floor with the same rag that your grandmother used back when your father still had hair and hope. If you're lucky, the baby hasn't soiled the good cloak. If you're very lucky, the amphora didn't crack when your niece knocked it over yesterday, trying to escape her chores. Again, you mutter a prayer to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, while scrubbing goat shit off a clay tile with a sponge that smells like last year's plague. She does not answer. You don't go to the agora. You don't go to the gymnasium. You don't go to the theater unless your husband is feeling generous or forgets to say no. You live in the gymnasium, the women's quarters, and if you leave it too often, people will whisper. If you speak too loudly, they'll assume you're a courtesan. If you ask too many questions, they'll say you read too much. If you read at all, someone will remind you that women's minds are for children and linen, not scrolls and strategy. Your education, if you got any, involved how to count eggs, mix dough, and avoid public disgrace. Geometry is for boys. Rhetoric is for boys. You keep the house from falling apart while men argue about justice over figs. Marriage isn't a choice. It's a transfer. You go from one household to another, from father to husband, like a parcel with a dowry attached. usually in your early teens, often to someone twice your age. You may or may not meet him beforehand. You may or may not survive childbirth, which happens as soon as possible and often without warning. Love is not expected. Obedience is. Your value is in how well you produce male children and how rarely your name is heard in the streets. If you're widowed, your options collapse. You can't inherit most property. You can't remarry freely. You go from an invisible wife to a visible burden. Of course, there are exceptions. If you're a Spartan woman, you might own land, you might train, speak publicly, even get an education. You might terrify Athenian men simply by existing. But don't romanticize it too fast. Your entire life revolves around producing warriors for the state. And if your sons die in battle, you are praised for not crying too much. If they survive but shame Sparta, it's your fault. If you yourself fall ill or infertile, well, there's always another girl to bring in. Your freedom is conditional, not liberation, but militarized motherhood. You are not free. You are a reproductive strategy with abs. And if you think goddess worship makes things better, don't. The Greeks loved their goddesses in myth, but not in person. Athena is worshipped, yes, but no one wants you to act like her. Artemis is revered, but only because she lives in the woods and doesn't attend symposiums. Hera is the queen of the gods, but spends eternity being cheated on and turning other women into animals out of spite. You're expected to channel them selectively. Wise like Athena, loyal like Hera, modest like Hestia, fertile like Demeter, but never loud, never public, never powerful. You are at once sacred and expendable, worshipped in abstract and dismissed in body. Your name will not be written. Your voice will not be recorded. You will keep this house from falling apart, keep this family fed, and keep your daughters quiet enough to survive. And when you die, too young, most likely from childbirth, illness, or exhaustion, you'll be wrapped in fabric that smells of bread and sweat and buried in a grave that says, wife of, and not much else, because in this civilization of drama, reason, and eternal marble, you are expected to leave no mark except in the linen you wove. You live in the birthplace of democracy, or so they say, but unless you're a freeborn male citizen over 18 with Athenian parents on both sides and enough leisure time to care about civic duty, democracy in practice is just a loud gathering you're not invited to. The assembly, the ecclesia, is where policy is made, wars are declared, and speeches are shouted over each other until someone either wins the argument or dies of heat stroke. You might imagine a grand process of enlightenment. Debate. In reality, it's a crowd of thousands packed into an open-air amphitheater, sunburnt and restless, making decisions that affect people who are never allowed to be in the room. Women can't vote. Foreigners can't vote. Slaves obviously can't vote. Most residents of Athens, in fact, can't vote. That's not a bug. That's the system. And the people who do vote are not professionals. There are no senators, no elite legislators, no legal experts. Just a rotating cast of citizens who pull their names from a lottery and suddenly find themselves in charge of trade regulations, military funding, or homicide trials. Your fishmonger might be deciding the fate of a general. Your neighbor's cousin, who believes dreams are caused by eating figs at the wrong hour, might now oversee naval logistics. Qualifications are not required. What's required is showing up and yelling loudly enough to matter. And even if you're part of this exclusive club of citizen men, you're never safe from the system turning on you. You see, the Athenian experiment in freedom comes with a built-in eject button called ostracism. Once a year, the citizens gather to write the name of someone they'd like to see exiled on a broken piece of pottery. An ostracan. No trial. No defense. No specific crime needed. Just a strong public consensus that you become a bit too influential, a bit too rich, or a bit too insufferable 6,000 votes, and you're gone. 10 years. No questions. Pack your sandals and leave. You can be exiled for being too popular, too good at war, too convincing in speeches. You could be exiled for having a face that people remember, a beard that offends the council, or just the misfortune of winning too many arguments in the marketplace. One of the most famously virtuous men in Athens, Aristides the Just, was ostracized because someone was tired of hearing how just he was. That's the level of democracy we're dealing with. The kind where envy has legal teeth and civic pride is a blood sport. The paradox is that for all its exclusion, Athenian democracy is still revolutionary. It gives a portion of ordinary men more political power than almost any other society in the ancient world. You are expected to participate, to vote, to speak, to serve on juries, to lead if chosen, to sacrifice your time, energy, and often your safety in the name of collective self-governance. You might be bad at it. You might hate it. You might be terrified of public speaking and allergic to olive-based. Legislation doesn't matter. It's your civic duty. But don't get too comfortable, step out of line, ask the wrong question, or get too clever for your own good. And you might end up like Socrates, forced to drink poison after being found guilty of corrupting the youth and introducing new gods, which in Athenian terms means being annoying at dinner parties. Democracy giveth, and democracy very much taketh away. And if you're one of the voiceless majority, a woman, a slave, a medic, a foreign-born resident who pays taxes but can't vote, or a child, your role is to obey the laws decided by men who probably forgot to wash their feet before the vote. You might be smarter. You might be better educated. You might actually understand what an economy is. None of that matters. You don't get a vote. You don't get a say. You get to live in the glorious birthplace of democracy, but only in the part of it where democracy politely ignores your existence. You don't have to look far to see who really keeps the city functioning. They are everywhere, yet you are not supposed to see them. You pass them on the street. They cook your food. They clean your floor. They raise your children and carry your purchases through the market. They're the reason you can attend the assembly or write mediocre poetry in the gymnasium while oiling your chest and pretending to think about virtue. Slavery in ancient Greece isn't a hidden shame. It's a public foundation, open, normalized, and deeply embedded into every facet of life. If you think civilization was built on freedom and philosophy, you've mistaken the marble for the scaffolding underneath it, and that scaffolding is human. Slaves are not defined by race. They're defined by circumstance, by being born in the wrong city, losing the wrong war, being kidnapped by pirates, or simply having the misfortune to be sold at market that day. You could be a Thracian, a Scythian, a Syrian, or another Greek. It doesn't matter. Once enslaved, your name becomes optional, your rights disappear, and your fate is tied to the will of someone else's hunger, laziness, or mood. In a typical household, even a modest one, there will be at least one slave. Not because the family is wealthy, but because slave labor is so deeply expected that not having one raises eyebrows. A household without a slave is like a kitchen without fire. If you are lucky, you are a domestic slave. You clean, cook, grind grain, fetch water, manage supplies, tend to children, and endure. You are part of the furniture. Spoken to only when needed. Expected to anticipate needs before they're voiced. If you fail, the punishment is swift. If you succeed, the best you get is being ignored. Some slaves are skilled. They might be scribes, teachers, accountants, or managers of entire estates. There are educated slaves who handle complex affairs, handle money, and resolve disputes. And yet, a slave who manages a shop or teaches a child is still property, still subject to sale, abuse, or disposal at their owner's whim. A clever slave might rise to favor, might be trusted, might even be envied. but never free. Not truly. Others are sent to hellholes worse than any battlefield. In the silver mines of Lorient, slaves, including children, crawl into pitch-black shafts, hacking rock from narrow walls and suffocating heat, breathing in toxic dust until their lungs fail and their bodies collapse. They die anonymously, entombed beneath the wealth they'll never see. No names, no funerals, no coins for sharing. Just the sound of pickaxes and coughing in the dark. Abuse is common. Beatings are legal. Branding is practiced. There is no punishment for mistreating a slave unless you damage someone else's property. A slave can be executed without trial. Rape is not considered a crime if it involves a slave. They are not persons before the law. They are economic tools with vocal cords and bloodstreams. And yet the system insists this is normal, natural, even Aristotle, the great mind of reason, defends it. Some people, he writes, are slaves by nature. This is what passes for philosophy. There is manumission, freedom granted by master, but it's rare and never total. A freed slave still owes loyalty to their former owner, still can't vote, still can't own land in most cases, still lives with the shadow of what they were. Freedom, in this society, is not something you earn. It's something granted to you arbitrarily and never without strings. And no one dares question the system outright. There's no abolitionist movement, no rebellion in the making. The idea that slavery itself might be wrong doesn't circulate. Not in Athens, not in Sparta, not in the public square or the private home. It just is. So yes, Greek society gave the world ideals of reason, of beauty, of freedom. But behind every statue of a thoughtful youth is someone who polished the marble for 12 hours and got whipped for sneezing too close to it. Behind every playwright is a slave copying scripts by torchlight. Behind every grand banquet, there's a kitchen full of backs that never straightened again. You may marvel at the glory of ancient Greece, but it was built step by step on the bones of people no one bothered to remember. You might imagine the daily economy of ancient Greece as a proud tableau of bustling market stalls, glinting amphorae, and the warm chatter of civic virtue over ripe figs. And technically, yes, there's a market. There are goods. There is shouting. But in practice, the Greek economy is held together by sweat, noise, and the profound understanding that if you're not working, you're either rich, dead, or philosophizing under a tree because no one will hire you. Most Greeks work. They have to. There's no state welfare, no unemployment safety net, and certainly no comfortable middle class. You work because otherwise you starve. Your work is manual, seasonal, repetitive, and utterly indifferent to your sense of personal fulfillment. If you're a farmer, and most people are, or at least live like one, you wake before dawn and trudge to a plot of land that's too dry, too stony, or too steep to be generous. You plant barley, wheat, maybe olives, or grapes if the soil behaves. You carry water by hand, chase off animals, break your back turning over stubborn earth, and hope this year the gods don't get bored and send a plague of something with legs and teeth. Harvest is a group effort powered by sunstroke and family guilt. There are no machines. You cut grain with a curved sickle until your fingers go numb, and then carry bundles on your shoulders until your spine begins to fantasize about amputation. Everything is done with tools older than your grandfather and slightly less ergonomic than despair. And when the crop is in, you pray that the tax collectors don't show up early, because if they do, your best grain goes to the city and you're left with whatever the rats and mildew didn't want. If you're not a farmer, maybe you're a potter. That means waking up early, turning clay with your feet, shaping vessels with hands that haven't known rest in years, and firing them in a kiln that belches smoke and ruin in equal parts. Pottery breaks often. So do you. Your kiln cracks, your glazes bubble, Your customers haggle like philosophy students arguing about ethics. And you spend your evenings sweeping shards off the floor and wondering whether democracy ever bought a single plate. Or you're a fisherman, which sounds poetic until you remember the Aegean can kill you with a breeze. Your boat is mostly holes wrapped in hope, and the nets take longer to mend than your own sanity. You row out before the sun rises, toss your lines, and wait, not in tranquil silence, but in the creaking, sloshing, stomach-turning pitch of a sea that has no interest in feeding you. Maybe you bring back sardines. Maybe you bring back a stomach parasite. Either way, you'll be selling it at the market tomorrow while trying to ignore the smell coming from your own tunic. The market, the agora, is the center of it all. You go not to stroll, but to hustle. You sell onions, wine, tools, olive oil, fabric, anything that might buy you a chance to do it all again tomorrow. Every price is debated. Every coin examined like it might be counterfeit. Merchants shout over each other. Animals defecate in public. Philosophers clog the walkways by lecturing about justice between stalls selling donkey bridles and dried squid. Flies are everywhere. So is gossip, theft, body, odor, and the heavy cloud of human fatigue. Women sell thread, wool, eggs, and bread, if they're poor enough or widowed enough to be allowed outside without scandal. Slaves do the hauling. Freedmen do the begging. Citizens do the yelling. Everyone is tired. Deals are made in haste, broken in silence, and argued about for weeks. If you're lucky, you made just enough to buy new sandals before the old ones fall apart in the middle of a funeral. If not, you go home with fewer coins and more reasons to blame the gods. And it doesn't stop. There are no weekends, no holidays off unless the festival requires it. The only rest is forced from injury, arrest, or death. Everyone is moving, working, bartering, lifting, dragging, shouting, or pretending to look busy in front of someone wealthier. This is the economy of the ancient world, a web of labor, debt, subsistence, an exhaustion spun by people too busy to philosophize and too tired to revolt. And through this daily grind of mud, sweat, and market rot, there they are, the philosophers. They emerge like sandal-wearing thought experiments, materializing beside fig stands or under olive trees with no warning and even less mercy. You're trying to sell 2 onions and a cracked amphora, and suddenly a man with no shoes and too many opinions asks, "What is truth?" Not rhetorically, not politely, with the intensity of someone who will not leave until you participate in a surprise oral exam on metaphysics. This is not entertainment. This is cultural assault with vocabulary. In Athens especially, philosophy is everywhere. It's not an academic discipline locked in scrolls and study rooms. It's the city's unofficial sport. Loud, aggressive, and performed in public spaces by men who measure wisdom in decibels. Socrates is the most famous, not because he wrote books, he didn't, or bathed often, also no, but because he refused to shut up. He wandered the city like an ambulatory riddle, targeting anyone who looked slightly confident and breaking their worldview apart. Like stale Mazza, you couldn't avoid him. You could only hope he found a richer victim before he got to you. The method is simple. Ask questions until the other person forgets their own name. Do you believe in justice? Yes. What is justice? You stumble. Can injustice ever be just? Now you're sweating. Is sweating just a kind of bodily injustice? Congratulations. You've just had a Socratic dialogue. You didn't want it. You didn't consent to it. But now you're part of intellectual history and possibly late to your own wedding. Socrates students are no better. Plato writes dialogues so dense they could be used as foundation stones. He opens a school, the academy, where men sit under trees and debate concepts like the good, the soul, and whether forms exist independently of objects. Aristotle, Plato's star pupil, goes further. He tries to categorize everything: animals, ethics, government, friendship, drama, sleep habits, why goats scream, all of it. He's brilliant, prolific, and a terrible party guest. Philosophy is not an idle pursuit. It infiltrates politics, education, science, and even theater. Children learn the basics. Citizens are expected to have opinions about ethics and governance. Philosophers advise generals, shape laws, tutor tyrants, and occasionally drive entire cities to madness by overthinking basic concepts. They're respected, yes, but also feared because they are not beholden to comfort, tradition, or convenience. They ask why. They ask how. They ask in public, and they don't wait for permission. And the city tolerates them, even celebrates them, until it doesn't. When Socrates pushes too far, mocks the gods, questions too many sacred cows, and inspires too many youth to talk back to their elders, the city decides enough is enough. He's tried, convicted, and executed, not with violence, but with protocol, forced to drink hemlock in the name of civic order. And even then, he dies talking, questioning the nature of the soul between sips of poison. But for most people, philosophy is not liberation. It's background noise. You're too busy hammering nails or chasing chickens to ponder the nature of beauty. You overhear debates while carrying water, while mending nets, while trying not to trip over men arguing about virtue in the middle of a path. Sometimes it's interesting. Often it's annoying. Occasionally, it makes you cry into your barley because you realized halfway through chewing that free might be an illusion and you still owe your neighbor 2 eggs. And yet, despite everything, the arrogance, the madness, the sandal-based shouting matches, philosophy persists because it gives the Greeks something they lack elsewhere: a way to argue without violence, a method to examine suffering, a framework for hope. It offers, to those with time and courage, a ladder out of ignorance. The rest of you? You just want to sell your onions without being asked what it means to be alive. You don't need philosophy to remind you that life is fragile. Your lungs do that when they rattle in your chest like a dying lyre string. Your joints remind you when they swell like overcooked lentils. Your teeth, what's left of them, ache with every bite of barley that wasn't quite softened in the wine water. In ancient Greece, the concept of health is not preventative, nor is it comforting. It is reactive, desperate, and largely symbolic. There are no hospitals, no clinics, no emergency protocols. There is illness, and there's the hope that someone nearby knows the name of a herb that doesn't kill you faster. If you fall sick, you stay home, usually in the same mat-strewn room as your entire family, coughing into the darkness while your cousin argues with a goat and someone else grinds grain. Maybe someone boils water and adds something bitter to it. Maybe they light incense or mumble a prayer to Asclepius, the god of healing, whose temples are filled with the moaning, the hopeful, and the obviously dying. If you're wealthy, you send for a physician, one who carries scrolls and speaks in humors. Not jokes, but fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Everything wrong with you, according to these men, is because one of these is out of balance. You're bleeding too much blood, depressed, clearly black bile, coughing. The phlegm is staging a coup. The solution is often worse than the ailment. You might be bled with knives, leeched by suggestion, fasted until your bones complain, or force-fed garlic, vinegar, and boiled figs until your dignity flees the body altogether. There is no anesthesia. There is no antiseptic. There is, if you're unlucky enough to need surgery, a collection of iron tools that look like farming implements and prayers that sound like apologies. For dental issues, there's pliers and shouting. For broken limbs, there's splinting and more shouting. And if something needs to be amputated, you'll be handed a leather strap to bite and a large man to hold you still. You will not be told it will be okay. It will not be okay. Midwives handle birth, which means they also handle death. Because childbirth is less miracle, more lottery with fatal consequences. A woman in labor might be surrounded by experienced hands, oil-soaked cloths, and chants to Ilethia, the goddess of childbirth, and still die screaming. A bad angle, a breech position, a snapped cord, a delayed push. Any of these can kill both mother and child. No stitches, no antibiotics, no backup plan. If the baby lives, it's wrapped and whispered over. If not, it's buried quietly, often anonymously, in a corner of the yard. No one talks about it, but everyone knows. Plagues come like weather. The city of Athens, at the height of its power, is nearly undone by one. A sickness that rips through the population and kills a third of the city. Thucydides survives it and writes about it, detailing symptoms that sound like horror. Fever, thirst, ulcers, blindness, despair. Corpses pile in temples. Funeral rites are skipped. Dogs gnaw the unburied. People stop caring for each other. The sick lie unattended while the healthy flee or die trying to pretend they're immune. Disease is not rare. It is regular. It's not a tragedy. It's a backdrop. And yet, despite all this, the Greeks developed theories. They try. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, insists that illness is not divine punishment, but natural cause. He writes about prognosis, observation, ethics. He tells his students to do no harm, and then hands them tools that do exactly that. The Hippocratic Oath is born in a world where medical care is part ritual, part experiment, and part performance art involving bloodletting and goat lard. Progress is slow. Hope is conditional. You recover if your body lets you, or you don't. There's no rehabilitation, no therapist, no support group. You return to work missing a toe, a lung, or part of your optimism. You're congratulated for surviving and expected to continue as if nothing happened. Illness in ancient Greece is not a pause. It's a test of endurance. And failure means obscurity, a short epitaph, and your neighbors fighting over your mat before it cools. And after you've hacked up phlegm, survived a goat-borne fever, and watched your neighbor die from stepping on the wrong splinter, maybe you want something uplifting, a bit of culture, some distraction, a momentary break from the constant drumbeat of mortality. That's when you head to the theater, not because you have tickets or taste, but because in ancient Greece, theater is not optional. It's civic, it's ritual, it's religion. And most of all, it's long. Not just bring a blanket long, but say goodbye to your family long. You're not watching a play. You're entering an endurance trial disguised as emotional enrichment. The festival of Dionysia, held in honor of the god of wine, madness, and creative chaos, turns Athens into a roaring hive of public emotion and armpit exposure. Thousands of citizens flood the open-air theater of Dionysus, carved into the rocky slope of the Acropolis. Seating is by status, of course. The best stone benches go to officials, priests, and whoever bribed the right functionary. The rest of you sit wherever there's space not yet claimed by a cloaked armpit or a child urinating. Discreetly behind a column, you arrive at dawn. The sun is already a threat. You've brought no snacks, not because you forgot, but because you're not allowed to. There's no shade, no intermissions, no breaks unless you count the moments when you briefly lose consciousness from dehydration and wake up mid-monologue. You will sit there all day, tragedies in the morning, comedies in the afternoon. Satyr plays as a sort of emotional palate cleanser between existential screams. The entire city becomes an audience. If you show up late, people hiss. If you talk, people hiss. If you leave early, the gods hiss. The plays themselves are not light. Greek tragedy is a parade of family dysfunction, divine revenge, murder, incest, war, betrayal, madness, and slow-motion emotional collapse. Heroes fall because they made a mistake 17 years ago and the god just got around to noticing. Mothers kill sons. Sons kill fathers. Daughters are sacrificed to secure better sailing weather. If someone is happy in Act 1, they will be covered in blood by Act 3. And you watch it all unfold through actors wearing towering masks with frozen expressions and voices that echo like divine judgment from a well. Then come the comedies, but not the kind that make you laugh easily. These are rude, absurd, pointed, and full of bodily functions. They mock politicians by name. They parody philosophers, insult cities, expose scandals, and occasionally feature talking animals with surprisingly strong opinions about naval policy. There are phalluses the size of loaves of bread. There are songs that sound like lawsuits. There are dances that make your elderly uncle clutch his tunic. You don't laugh because it's subtle. You laugh because someone in a mask just fell on their face yelling about olives, and you haven't had a real bath in a week. Every performance is accompanied by a chorus, a group of singers, dancers, and philosophical narrators who move in sync and shout comments like a Twitter thread with musical backing. They wear costumes, sometimes elaborate, sometimes nightmarish, and they chant things like "Woe to the House of Atrus," while flapping their arms and stomping like tragic flamingos. You're never quite sure whether they're helpful or just another form of civic punishment. Either way, you clap when they're done, or at least stop crying. At the end of it all, after 3 days of relentless performance, a jury of citizens votes on which playwright did the best job of turning everyone's emotional insides into philosophical pudding. The winner receives a wreath and eternal glory. The losers get jeered and, if unlucky, remembered only for the play where someone forgot their lines and improvised a tragic speech about tax reform. You leave the theater sunburnt, dehydrated, emotionally scoured, and slightly unsure whether you've learned something or just aged a decade. You wander home, repeating lines about fate, doom, and what it means to be human. And maybe, just maybe, you understand you're suffering a little better, or maybe you just want to punch the next goat you see. By the time the last chorus has stomped its final lament, and you've trudged home in sandals that feel like remorse wrapped in leather, you might be tempted to believe you've endured the worst. But ancient Greece, ever generous with its horrors, has one more gift tucked under its peplos: death. Not the clean, solemn, neatly packaged death of modern fiction, but the kind that happens on the floor of your home, in the street, in the bath, or in the arms of a midwife who's seen too much. It is sudden or slow, cruel or indifferent, but it always arrives, uninvited, unwashed, and usually at the worst possible moment. If you're lucky, you die of something dramatic: battlefield wounds, plague, childbirth. Those at least come with an explanation. More often, death comes disguised as something minor: a scratch that festers, a fever that doesn't break, a bad oyster, a stone in your sandal that leads to an infected blister and then sepsis. You don't have antibiotics. You don't even have bandages worthy of the name. What you have is garlic compresses, oil, and screaming. Maybe a neighbor mutters a prayer. Maybe a priest waves some incense. Maybe the gods are in a forgiving mood, but probably not. When you die, it is the responsibility of your family to prepare your body quickly. The soul, they believe, must cross into the underworld within a specific time frame, or it risks wandering, lost, a ghost with a poor sense of direction and an eternal grudge. Your eyes are closed with coins, not out of sentiment, but so Sharon, the ferryman of the dead, will take you across the river Styx. No coin, no passi. You'll be stuck on the riverbank, watching eternity roll by with other broke spirits. Your body is washed, oiled, wrapped in cloth that smells of ash and mildew, and displayed for mourning. Loud mourning. Public wailing is not only accepted, it's expected. If your family doesn't cry loud enough, it reflects badly on you, on them, on your ancestors, Professional mourners can be hired to shriek, beat their breasts, and weep theatrically over your extremely average legacy. A good death is noisy. A bad death is silent. The worse the life, the louder the send-off. It's math. Then comes the burial, if you can afford one. The body is taken outside the city walls, ideally before the third day. Cremation is an option, but expensive. Burial is cheaper, but not without risk. If your family is poor, your grave is shallow, your marker modest, your memory easily forgotten. If they're very poor, you might not get buried at all, just dumped discreetly in a ditch with others who also failed to secure the minimum dignity package. No grave means no peace, the Greeks believe. That unburied souls cannot enter Hades. They wander, they rot, they whisper to the living. And you thought taxes were the worst part of being poor. And it doesn't end there. The dead can still cause problems. If you didn't complete the proper rites, if you skipped a sacrifice, if your family offered spoiled wine, if a cousin forgot to mention your name during the annual remembrance, you might come back. Not in a romantic, poetic way. In a why is that door creaking and who keeps knocking at midnight way. Restless spirits are real to the Greeks. They're feared. They're blamed for disease, misfortune, impotence, and that time the wine jug. Cracked for no reason. If something goes wrong, it's either the gods or someone you forgot to bury properly. And the gods, oh, the gods, they do not offer comfort in death. They offer rules. Complicated, contradictory, and often fatal rules. Step into the wrong grove, offend a minor woodland spirit, forget to purify yourself after touching a corpse, or simply sneeze at the wrong time during a sacrifice, and your soul might spend eternity in Tartarus, the underworld's underworld, where punishment is doled out with mythic creativity, eternally rolling boulders, endlessly refilling jugs, snakes wear. You don't want them. Not all souls go there. But the anxiety that you might keeps many a Greek up at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember if they ever insulted Hera accidentally during a festival. So you live carefully, die reluctantly, and hope that someone, somewhere, remembers your name long enough to keep you anchored in the land of the honored dead. But most don't. Most people die like they lived, in the background, beneath the shadows of temples and monuments built for the few who manage to impress both men and gods. Your death won't be carved in marble. It'll be whispered briefly, then replaced by news of the next bad harvest or whose goat wandered into the temple again. And yet, for all the fear, the rituals, the incense, and the endless funerals, death is just another part of the cycle. It comes. It's endured. It's interpreted. And then the city moves on, its stones echoing with the footsteps of the living and the silence of those who once shouted in the agora, argued in the baths, or cried at the theater. The underworld fills, the streets empty, and somewhere a philosopher scribbles a new question into the dirt with a stick and wonders aloud what it all means. And if you think the gods might offer comfort, stability, or a sense of divine order in this sweaty, brittle, goat-haunted mess of a life, then you haven't been paying attention. Because the gods of ancient Greece are not kind. They are not consistent. They are not, strictly speaking, invested in your happiness. They are powerful, yes. Revered, certainly. Feared, always. But loved? That depends on how well your last sacrifice went. Greek religion isn't about worshiping a loving creator. It's about managing a volatile divine ecosystem where every god has a grudge, a weakness, a favorite city, and a bad habit of turning mortals into shrubs when offended. You don't go to temple because you wanna. You go because you have to. You light incense, pour wine, slaughter animals, burn barley, and mumble oaths not out of spiritual longing, but because you need your crops to grow, your wife not to die in childbirth, and your roof not to catch fire during a festival. Religion is insurance. It's diplomacy. It's spiritual hostage negotiation with beings who might hurl a plague at you because someone 3 generations ago insulted a priest by stepping on the wrong threshold. The major gods live on Mount Olympus, a mountain that you will never climb and where you're most definitely not welcome. Zeus, the thunder-happy king of gods, rules by adultery and dramatic timing. Hera, his wife and sister, is queen of the gods and spends most of her divine bandwidth making life miserable for any woman Zeus has looked at with intent. Athena is wisdom incarnate, but also the kind of goddess who will turn you into an owl for misspeaking. Apollo is the sun, music, medicine, and also occasional mass murder. Poseidon is moody, vengeful, and personally responsible for at least half of your fishing accidents. And that's just the headliners. There are nymphs in every stream, spirits in every tree, monsters behind every boulder. There are household gods you have to feed, river gods you must not urinate near, and regional deities who will absolutely ruin your harvest if you forget their obscure feast day. You're surrounded, constantly, spiritually outnumbered. You make offerings because bad things happen when you don't. Not always, not reliably, but just often enough to keep you paranoid. Did your child fall ill because you forgot to honor Artemis last week? Maybe. Did the hailstorm destroy your barley because your neighbor used spoiled wine in a ritual? Could be. Are you being punished for a dream you don't remember having? Entirely possible. Worship is woven into everything. Before planting, you offer to Demeter. Before a journey, Poseidon. Before a business deal, Hermes. Before a duel, Ares. Before marriage, Aphrodite. Before sleep, you whisper to Hypnos and hope no gods show up in your dreams looking for revenge. Every major life event has a god attached, and most minor ones do too. There are temples, yes, grand stone marvels with columns and friezes and statues. But most of your offerings happen at little altars at roadside, shrines, in corners of courtyards where you mutter prayers through your teeth and hope the gods are listening selectively. And don't even think about asking why. The gods don't owe you reasons. If you suffer, maybe it's punishment. Maybe it's a lesson. Maybe they're bored. Maybe they're having a feud with another god and you're collateral. Greek religion is not a dialogue. It's a performance. You do your part as precisely and reverently as possible, and the gods might spare you their worst. And if you break a taboo, if you touch something sacred with the wrong hand, speak the wrong word during a rite, or walk into a grove reserved for virgins with a full beard and yesterday's hangover, you won't get a stern warning. You'll get divine retribution with a mythological flavor. Your house burns. Your fields rot. Your child speaks in tongues, and your livestock won't stop screaming. Ancient gods punish not just you, but your descendants. Bloodlines can be cursed for generations because one ancestor made a snarky comment at the wrong festival. But despite all the terror, the people believe. They really do. Because the gods are woven into every story, every ritual, every law, every stone. Their festivals are the only real holidays. Their myths explain thunder, love, death, and why your neighbor's cow just keeled over in the street. You may not trust the gods, but you cannot live without them. They are your landlords, your weather forecast, your legal system, your fertility clinic, and your afterlife concierge. And so, you pray, you pour the wine, you sacrifice the goat, you burn the barley, you stare at the sky and mutter apologies for sins you didn't mean to commit. Because in this world, there are no atheists, just people who are currently between disasters. You think the gods are capricious? Try being popular in Athens. Divine wrath may be mysterious, but civic resentment is downright systematic. For all its proud boasting about democracy, Athens has built into its political structure one of the most passive-aggressive social defense mechanisms in human history: ostracism. And unlike war or plague or goat-related misfortune, ostracism doesn't come from above. It comes from your fellow citizens, your neighbors, the people you bumped elbows with at the market, the ones you lent that. Extra amphora to last week. You're not exiled because you broke a law. You're exiled because people find you a bit too much. Here's how it works. Once a year, the citizens gather in the agora and vote on whether to hold an ostracism. Not who to ostracize, just whether they're in the mood to exile someone. If the general feeling is yes, someone needs to go, the city proceeds to the next step. Each citizen takes a broken piece of pottery, an ostracon, and scratches a name into it. Not a reason, not an accusation, just a name. If a particular name appears 6,000 times or more, congratulations. That person is officially too influential, too charismatic, or just too visible, and they are now required to pack up their life and vanish for 10 years. No trial, no rebuttal, no list of charges. It's not banishment for crimes. It's banishment for being the human equivalent of a loud tunic. Did you argue too well in the assembly? Led a little too effectively in the war? Host dinner parties with a guest list that makes people nervous? Goodbye. See you in a decade. You're not imprisoned. You're not stripped of property. Your house remains. Your family stays, but you leave immediately. You have a few days to gather your things and walk out of the city like yesterday's news, knowing full well that it wasn't enemies who did this to you. It was your fellow citizens, democratically, politely, and with complete procedural legitimacy. The process isn't even anonymous. People talk. People remember. Someone recognizes your handwriting. Someone starts rumors. Maybe you wrote down Themistocles because you genuinely believe he's a danger to the Republic, or maybe you're just tired of hearing his name every time someone mentions naval reforms. It doesn't matter. Enough votes and he's gone. You can say you were defending democracy. You can say you were keeping power in check. But let's be honest, half of Athens voted against. Aristides the Just because they were tired of hearing how just he was. And then, 10 years later, the ostracized can come back. No grudges. No lawsuits. No, please explain why you were so dangerously effective. You just stroll back into town, maybe find your house's roof is gone, maybe find your cousin has married your wife, and resume your life. That's it. No plaque. No apology. Just a decade of exile because you peaked too early. But here's the true madness. The system works, at least according to the Athenians. It prevents tyranny, they say. It keeps powerful men in check. It allows society to breathe, to vent its jealousies and anxieties without civil war. It's a safety valve dressed up as civic virtue. And it's not even rare. It happens often enough that everyone knows someone who's been ostracized. Everyone lives with the low, thrumming fear that popularity is a liability, that competence is dangerous, that being liked too much by the public is a short road to being absent from it. So you learn to be careful. Speak well, but not too well. Lead, but don't stand too far in front. Be memorable, but not remarkable. And above all, never be the answer that comes to mind when someone asks, who's getting a little too big for his sandals? Because in Athens, democracy doesn't just elect, it ejects. So you tread carefully. You lower your voice when it rises too high. You temper your opinions with shrugs. You pretend not to notice when the conversation shifts from philosophy to gossip, from politics to pottery shards. Because you've learned the one truth that all long-lived Athenians eventually learn. It's not enough to survive the agora. You must survive the whisper. And all this tightrope walking wouldn't feel so maddening if you had more time to enjoy the view. But you don't, because in ancient Greece, you're not built to last. Not biologically, not socially, not statistically. The average life expectancy hovers somewhere around 35, and that's if you make it out of childhood. which is a very large, very optimistic. If infant mortality is vicious, as many as 1 in 3 babies won't make it past their first few years. Diarrhea can kill. Colds can kill. Teething, in some cases, is a medical event with betting odds. Children are born at home, in dim rooms, into the arms of midwives with no formal training, armed only with linen rags and prayers to deities, who specialize in not listening during labor. If the baby doesn't cry, everyone else does. If the mother doesn't bleed out, it's considered a good day. There are no records, no names for many, just short, hot lives that vanish between festivals. And if you do survive those first few perilous years, congratulations. Now you're eligible for every other horrifying way to die. You'll grow up on a diet of barley, wine, and whatever the sea didn't drag away. You'll have no access to vitamins, no idea what scurvy is, and no way to fix it if your gums start bleeding or your bones quietly crumble. Your teeth will rot by your 20s. You'll squint against the sun until your eyes turn against you. You'll break something, a finger or rib, your pride, and simply live with it until it stops hurting or stops moving. There's no growing old as a concept. There's just not dying yet. You measure your time by seasons and injuries. Your body begins its betrayal early. Knees ache from squatting, shoulders creak from rowing, your back stiffens from sleeping on mats full of straw and ambition. Illness is everywhere, not epidemic, but atmospheric. You breathe in other people's coughs. You share water with the goats. You drink wine because the alternative is dysentery. You learn to distinguish fevers by color. Yellow is bile, black is death. You hope you only get the yellow. And then there's war. If you're male and even vaguely upright, odds are you'll die in one. It might be glorious, but probably not. You'll be shoved into a phalanx, told to trust the man next to you, and marched into a storm of spears, arrows, and shouts. You might last 1 battle. You might last 3. Eventually, someone slips, someone panics, someone misses the shield rhythm by half a second, and your entrails are helping fertilize a disputed olive grove. That's if you die cleanly. If not, you might drag yourself home, bleeding, feverish, and half a man. And Athens will thank you with a vague nod and a new tax. Even in peace, the city can kill. The streets are hard. The roofs are unreliable. Fires spread fast. A dropped torch in a windy courtyard, and suddenly half your neighborhood is ash and smoke. You might fall off a ladder. You might be crushed by a cart. You might drink something your uncle swore was medicinal and then spend the evening seeing centaurs before never waking up again. There are no safety rails, no inspections, no disclaimers. Just luck, ritual, and the occasional helpful scream from the neighbor who smelled something strange. But the worst part isn't the danger. It's the speed. Life doesn't just end. It races you to the finish line. You're married at 15, a parent by 16, a widow by 20. And if you make it to 40, people start whispering about what you did to live that long. You watch your friends die early, your siblings fade, your children cough themselves to death while the goat chews on a last good blanket. And there is no pause, no grief leave, no collective hug. You bury them in the soil behind. The house, burn what must be burned, mutter something vaguely poetic, and go back to grinding barley. Because if you stop, if you break, if you dare to let the weight settle, you don't eat. You keep going not because you believe in tomorrow, but because today isn't done squeezing the sweat out of you. Time in ancient Greece is not a river, it's a drought. And you are just one cracked amphora trying to hold enough to last until the evening. And yet, somehow, you do keep going. You patch your sandal for the 5th time. You chew your dry barley bread until it softens or your teeth give up. You sweep the dust off the floor with a bundle of twigs that used to be a broom and pretend it makes a difference. The day stretches on, not in a dramatic arc of triumph and tragedy, but in the quiet grind of domestic persistence. Hauling water, boiling grain, brushing flies off the baby's face, chasing chickens out of the andron, and wondering, not for the first time, whether that thudding noise in your left temple is divine punishment or just your body giving up its last polite warning. Your home is small. A few rooms, no windows, just wooden shutters to keep out goats, thieves, and the occasional Athenian who wandered in by accident during heated philosophical debate. The walls are made of sun-dried bricks or stones jammed together with mud and faith. In summer, they trap the heat like a bread oven. In winter, they invite every chill into your bones like an honored guest. There's no fireplace, no insulation, no distinction between public and private. You sleep in the same space you cook in, argue in, give birth in, and occasionally cry into a wet tunic when the weight of it all knots too tightly in your chest. Privacy is not a concept. It's a luxury, one you'll never afford. You know the sound of your neighbor's cough. You know what time the widow next door urinates. You hear every fight, every moan, every creaking floorboard in the building, and they hear yours. Gossip isn't entertainment. It's urban infrastructure. It moves faster than news, truer than scripture, and often more dangerous than any weapon. Your food, if you're lucky, consists of 2 real meals a day. In the morning, mazza, that stale barley cake again, possibly dunked in watered wine, possibly moldy, definitely disappointing. In the evening, something boiled. Lentils, maybe. On feast days, perhaps a sliver of fish or a pinch of cheese. If you're lucky enough to own a fig tree, you guard it with your life. If you raise chickens, you don't name them, because naming leads to affection, and affection leads to bad decisions when someone gets sick and needs soup. Your furniture is sparse, a wooden bench, a mat, a stool with 3 legs if you haven't had to burn the 4th. Your tools are heirlooms of poverty, chipped, dented, handed down through generations who also couldn't afford new ones. Your clothing is patched, rewoven, faded, stiff from sweat and dust. It smells like you, like the room you sleep in, like the goat that keeps eating the hem. You wear anyway. You wear it because it's all you have and because nudity, while philosophically acceptable in the gymnasium, still earns raised eyebrows when you're baking flatbread. And still, through it all, you work, you walk miles to fetch water, you scavenge for firewood, you barter with neighbors who owe you favors they'll never repay. You dig, you cook, you mend, you birth, you bury. There are no holidays unless the city declares a festival, and even then, you're probably cooking for someone else who's pretending they're celebrating. There's no retirement, no escape, just age if you make it that far, and the slow transformation into the person who tells younger. Greeks, how lucky they are to have both sandals. At night, when the sky turns the color of wet stone and the streets empty of debate and dung, you sit in your doorway and watch the last smoke curl from the neighbor's hearth. You listen to the groan of wood beams, the bark of a distant dog, the murmured prayers of someone too tired to finish their sentence. And you wonder, not dramatically, not philosophically, just quietly, how anyone managed to build temples and poems out of lives like this. How a city with no soap and too many goats gave birth to logic, literature, mathematics, medicine. How people just like you, tired, aching, hungry, found the strength not just to survive, but to create. Because that's the secret of ancient Greece. Not the myths, not the monuments, not the marbled faces of gods who never answer. It's the people who did all of this anyway, who scraped meaning from dust, built beauty from ruin, and left behind stories in the cracks of their broken bowls. So here you are, covered in sweat, dust, and the faint smell of vinegar-soaked goat hair, leaning against a cracked doorway in a crumbling courtyard where the most permanent thing is exhaustion. You've lived a day in ancient Greece. You've hauled the water, eaten the bread, scraped the oil, shouted at the marketplace, watched the theater, buried the dead, whispered to the gods, and ducked a few too many rhetorical questions about the nature of justice from a barefoot man holding olives like their divine symbols. And now, as the stars flicker into a sky so dark it looks like it might swallow the city, you finally get a moment to wonder, what did it all mean? Let's be clear, you wouldn't last. Not a full day. You, with your air conditioning, your filtered water, your painkillers, your mattress, your shower, your right to complain without consequence, and your freedom to leave a conversation when someone starts talking about metaphysics. You'd fold before breakfast. You'd collapse in the midday heat. You'd cry the first time you realized you were supposed to clean your skin with salad dressing and a bronze knife. Your back would give out during your first attempt to haul water uphill. Your spirit would crack at the fifth barley cake, and your will to live would be permanently damaged by the goat who refuses to stop sleeping on your feet. Because the real tragedy of ancient Greece isn't just the disease or the war or the relentless daily grind. It's that none of it pauses. There's no rest, no break, no day off to process the existential weight of it all. You don't get to ask, is this the best use of my brief time on Earth? Because someone needs to churn the cheese, and you're the only one whose hands aren't shaking yet. You survive because you have to. You don't question it because questioning it might make you fall apart. And no one else has time to pick you up. And yet, they did it. Not the heroes in the epics, not the philosophers in the marble halls, not the generals carving their names into history with other people's blood. The people. The ordinary, lice-bitten, sunburnt, sleepless masses. The women who wove until their fingers bled. The children who died too soon but were mourned like kings. The slaves who carried amphorae, built temples, and died unnamed. The farmers who never saw the inside of the theater but made sure the actors ate. They didn't just endure. They built. They carved beauty from chaos. They invented systems, political, mathematical, rhetorical, while living in mud brick houses with no plumbing and gods who punish them for sneezing at the wrong festival. You live in a world made possible by them. Your medicine, your philosophy, your architecture, your politics, your tragic narratives, and your comedies with awkward costumes. You walk through cities shaped by their shadows. You speak in logic they mapped with sharpened sticks and wild metaphors. You eat olives because they figured out how to tame that bitter fruit into something edible and occasionally divine. And while you scroll on a glowing device made of minerals they couldn't name, in a chair they'd think was a throne, surrounded by comforts they call witchcraft, you still wonder, sometimes, the same things they did. What is good? What is just? What does it mean to live well? So no, you wouldn't last a day. But if you did, if you adjusted to the dust and the filth and the noise and the heat, if you scraped through the first week without dying of shame, fungus, or philosophical exhaustion, you might just learn something brutal and beautiful. That greatness is born not from luxury, but from desperation. That wisdom doesn't descend from the heavens. It rises from the floor, sticky with sweat and crushed figs, where someone once whispered, there has to be a better way. And they were right. Because if life in ancient Greece was already a daily negotiation with dirt, heat, and disappointment, then death by the hand of the state was the final proof that the gods were not the only ones with a flair for cruel creativity. Justice here wasn't gentle, wasn't blind, and it certainly wasn't quick. In a society that worshipped reason and oratory, but also sent philosophers to their deaths for asking too many questions, executions weren't just about punishment. They were about punctuation. A dramatic, often public, full-body punctuation mark on a life deemed inconvenient, corrupt, or simply out of fashion. The most civilized execution was also the most famously ironic. Drinking poison. Not any poison, of course, but a measured dose of hemlock, the official beverage of state-sponsored goodbye letters. Socrates went out this way, surrounded by weeping students as he calmly discussed the immortality of the soul between convulsions. Hemlock doesn't kill instantly. It starts at your feet, crawling upward, paralyzing as it goes. You feel your toes numb, then your calves, then your chest seizes as. Your lungs forget how to breathe. It is quiet, it is slow, and it is the ancient equivalent of being told to die with dignity while everyone watches and takes notes. But most people weren't Socrates. Most people didn't get a philosophical exit. They got blood, screams, and the kind of inventive state violence that makes you wonder if the lawmakers were secretly playwrights. Stoning was a classic. Not the messy, mob-ruled chaos you might picture, but a ritual, a structured, civic, participatory murder where citizens each hurled a stone, ensuring no single person bore full responsibility, but everyone got a piece of the kill. It was democratic in the worst possible way. You could be stoned for adultery, for blasphemy, for being too inconvenient during a fragile political moment. And when it was done, no one was guilty, but someone was certainly dead. Another favorite was the apotopsis, the symbolic act of casting someone beyond the boundaries of human life. You could be thrown from a cliff, particularly if you were deemed unclean, cursed, or politically radioactive. In Sparta, infants deemed too weak or malformed were famously discarded this way, tossed into a gorge like a bad omen. In Athens, traitors might be denied burial altogether, their bodies left for the crows, a fate worse than death in a culture that believed unburied souls wandered the earth in restless agony. Crucifixion, though associated more with the Romans, made appearances in the Greek world too, especially in colonies and under tyrants who liked their warnings extra visible. The condemned would be nailed or tied to a wooden frame, hoisted up, and left to die slowly in the sun. Not instantly, not quietly, and not without the public getting a good long look. It wasn't about the death. It was about the process, the message, the theater of suffering. There were less elaborate but equally awful options. Flogging to death, burning, drowning in the sea, tied in a sack, possibly with a rooster, depending on who you offended, impalement. Even being locked in a cage and left to starve, your body eventually falling apart in a public square while children tossed pebbles and philosophers debated whether your soul had already left or was simply waiting for your liver to give up. And let's not forget the punishment by exile, which, though bloodless, was its own kind of slow-motion execution, a social death, a civic deletion. You weren't killed, but you were erased. You vanished from your city, from the records, from memory. Your name became an empty space in the chorus of civic life. No blood, no pyre, no screams, just silence. But the darkest part wasn't the punishments themselves. It was how normal they were, how accepted, how woven into the idea of justice and order and balance. You could debate ethics in the morning and stone a man by noon. You could watch a tragedy about hubris and fate, and then walk past a scaffold where some poor fool was living the final act. Justice wasn't just blind. It was brutal, poetic, and deeply theatrical. Because in ancient Greece, even death had to have structure, chorus, and a bit of metaphor. You thought the worst ancient Greece had to offer was the back-breaking labor, the lice, the barley, and the goats. But no, the gods might smite you. The agora might humiliate you. Your tunic might betray you in a stiff breeze. But nothing says you live in a deeply poetic but casually horrifying society, quite like its approach to law enforcement. Because when ancient Greeks decided you had crossed a line, moral, civic, or just popular, they didn't just punish you. They made you an example. A message, a metaphor carved into flesh. Justice wasn't about fairness. It was about reminding everyone else what happens when you push too far. And trust them. They had options. Execution wasn't some back alley event or quiet administrative note. It was theatrical, public, cathartic, a civic exclamation mark with blood on it. The state didn't just end your life, it framed it, contextualized it, turned it into a final act that everyone could learn from, fear, or argue about afterward in the bathhouse. You didn't just die. You were interpreted. And this was perfectly normal. You could be killed for treason, for sacrilege, for murder, for theft, for corruption, for being too friendly with the Persians, or just for being too loud in the assembly during the wrong fiscal quarter. Sometimes the reason wasn't even clear. Maybe you made enemies. Maybe someone got tired of seeing your name on the voting tablets. Maybe you just looked a little too confident while standing near the altar of Apollo. The city believed in the rule of law, yes, but also in the rule of spectacle. A death had to mean something. It had to feel like justice, even if no one could quite remember what the crime was. The crowd needed closure. The gods needed appeasement. And your family, well, they just needed to figure out whether they could still bury you before sunset. And it wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was silence, disappearance, social vaporization. Athens was particularly fond of a little procedure called ostracism, where the city calmly, methodically, and with full democratic decorum decided that someone was just a bit too much and voted them into oblivion. Not death, exactly. Just 10 years of legally enforced irrelevance. You didn't die. You were edited out. But when the state did decide to kill you, they had a range of tools that would make even the most dramatic playwright say, okay, maybe tone it down a little. Execution in Greece wasn't centralized or consistent. Each city-state had its own preferences, its own rituals, and its own way of saying, you've outlived your usefulness. And while some tried to dress it in the language of virtue or divine will, the truth was much simpler. It was a way to clean house, loudly. Sometimes you were given poison. Sometimes you were given stones. Sometimes you were given a one-way trip off a cliff with no ceremony whatsoever. Sometimes you were tied up, displayed, degraded, or destroyed slowly. Not because it was efficient, but because it was memorable. Because the city believed that justice had to be seen to exist, heard, smelled, and preferably shouted about until someone wrote a tragedy about it. You might have dreamed of glory, of virtue, of Olympic crowns and philosophical immortality. But one bad vote, one sharp-tongued rival, or one poorly timed metaphor at a symposium, and suddenly you're standing in the center of the square with a rope, a crowd, and a very public ending written by the state and directed by fear. And no one questions it. Not really, because questioning it might sound a little too much like hubris. And everyone remembers what happened to the last guy who got too philosophical about justice. You've spoken too freely. You've asked one too many questions. You've been accused of impiety, of corrupting the youth, of making the elders uncomfortable during wine hour. And now the court has spoken. Not with shouting or torches, but with majority vote and a sense of solemn inevitability. You're going to die. But because you're a citizen, and because this is Athens, the so-called cradle of reason, your execution won't be a spectacle of chains and screams. No, your sentence is refined, respectable, and medicinally ironic. You will drink poison, specifically hemlock, and you will die slowly, publicly, and ideally, with your dignity intact. This is the Socratic method of execution. The Athenians loved procedure. They had juries the size of small villages, trials that could last all day, and a deep cultural affection for doing things properly. And so, when they condemned a man to death, even one as inconveniently famous as Socrates, they didn't toss him to the wolves or burn him in the agora. They handed him a cup. A simple, seemingly harmless cup of greenish, bitter liquid that smelled faintly of crushed weeds and finality. And they expected him to drink it, sit down, quietly, and cease to exist in a manner befitting a rational adult. Hemlock works from the feet up. First, a numbness, A tingling that begins in your toes like a bad cramp or a chill. It spreads slowly but with relentless certainty, crawling up your legs, paralyzing as it goes. There's no convulsing, no choking, no blood. Just an eerie stillness that climbs through your body like a verdict written in muscle. Eventually, your chest stops responding. A diaphragm freezes. Your lungs forget their rhythm. You remain awake, painfully, fully aware, until the air simply no longer moves. Your mind, sharp to the last, watches as your body turns to stone. Socrates, of course, made it worse for everyone by being composed. He chatted with friends. He made jokes. He debated the soul as his legs gave out beneath him, turning his death into a tutorial on how to die without complaint. He turned execution into a lecture, and Athens, ever the conflicted parent of civilization, was left with the awkward realization that they'd just silenced their most famous citizen for the crime of being slightly too annoying. But Socrates wasn't the only one to drink hemlock. It was a standard sentence for certain crimes. Impiety, treason, public corruption, anything that made the city feel vaguely endangered but too polite to resort to stoning. Poison was clean, controlled. The condemned could say goodbye. They could arrange their affairs. They could die in a way that preserved the city's self-image as lawful, democratic, and above the messy chaos of raw vengeance. Of course, it wasn't always so neat. Some people tried to run. Some begged. Some drank and died screaming, their bodies racked with spasms because the dose was wrong or their constitution fought back. There was no antidote, no last-minute reprieve, just the expectation that you meet your end with the same decorum with which you were expected to discuss metaphysics at dinner. And the cup wasn't ceremonial. It was practical, brewed by a public executioner, measured carefully, and administered in a quiet corner of the prison while the guards looked away. There were no priests, no morning music, just a final silence, a cooling body, and a city that moved on with its business, satisfied that justice had been served, tastefully. But the real cruelty of the hemlock wasn't its effect. It was its symbolism. It said, "You will die not because you threatened us with violence, but because you made us uncomfortable with thought, and that discomfort in the wrong hands was treason." Socrates accepted it. Others didn't. But the outcome was always the same. A philosopher, a traitor, or a blasphemer sitting on a prison bench, eyes wide, legs numb, lungs heavy, wondering not why they must die, but whether the city they loved was worth dying for. If poison was the polite way to die, the civic curtain call for those with names and books and followers in the academy, then stoning was the raw, unfiltered, crowdsourced version of justice. No speeches, no metaphysical dialogues, no measured cups. Just you, the public square, and a rain of stones hurled by your neighbors with the fervor of people who've been saving up their disappointment all season. It was participatory execution, a blood ritual in democratic packaging, a murderware. Everyone got to be a little bit guilty, and no one had to feel too bad about it. Stoning wasn't random. It was procedure. It was ritual. And it came with its own twisted set of rules, because of course it did. The Greeks, even in their violence, loved a good structure. You didn't just throw someone into a crowd and shout go. No. First came the trial, the accusation, the vote, the discussion about whether this person had dishonored the gods, insulted the city, slept with someone they shouldn't have, or been caught doing something so awkwardly illegal that even the philosophers couldn't spin it. And then, if the people or the assembly or whatever jury had been gathered for the occasion decided that yes, this person must die, then came the stones. But here's the trick. No one person could be responsible. It had to be collective. Everyone had to throw. Everyone had to participate. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a community event. This was a society that argued democracy extended into everything, including execution. If someone was to die, then the city had to kill them together. No executioner, no single agent, just a group of citizens standing in a circle, lifting stones as if they were casting votes with sharp edges. And it was meant to take time. That was part of the punishment. There was no instant, clean death here, no arrow to the heart or blade to the neck. It was the slow collapse of a body under the pressure of dozens, sometimes hundreds of blows. The first few stones might bruise, the next would break skin, then ribs, then teeth. Eventually, something essential would shatter, and the condemned would fall. If they were lucky, they lost consciousness early. If not, they screamed, and the crowd kept, throwing until there was nothing left that looked human, just a pile of rocks and silence. It wasn't just vengeance, it was deterrent. It happened in open spaces, near marketplaces at crossroads, anywhere people might walk past and think twice about being clever with temple funds or saying something snide about Athena in public. Children watched, elders watched, strangers watched. You didn't just witness justice, you felt it in your arms and your fingertips, in the lingering ache of muscle that came from doing your civic duty by reducing a person to pulp. Sometimes the stones were supplied. Sometimes they were gathered on the spot. Sometimes, especially when the crowd was particularly eager, people brought their own, as if attending a particularly judgmental picnic. There were no uniforms, no designated throwers. You were just expected to do your part, because if you didn't, that might be noted too. And in a city where memory is long and grudges are carved into stone tablets, you didn't want to be the person who flinched. And don't imagine this was rare. It wasn't. It was used for adultery, for sacrilege, for theft, for treason, for being on the wrong side of a power shift, for daring to be too proud, too different, too vocal. It was the fallback execution when nothing else quite fit, the catch-all penalty for the unforgivable and the politically inconvenient. There was no body left to display, only a mound of stones and the collective decision that someone had ceased to be worthy of breathing Athenian air. You didn't get a funeral. You didn't get remembered. You got erased with force. Because in ancient Greece, justice didn't need robes or mercy. It needed only a vote, a crowd, and a good supply of rocks. If stoning was democracy at its ugliest, then death by falling was its coldest, a silent push instead of a collective roar. No speeches, no stones, no poetry, just a body, a cliff, and a long, ugly moment when the earth disappears beneath your feet and you realize that the city you were born in has decided you're unclean, not metaphorically, literally, religiously polluted, polluting the air just by breathing it. In Athens, they didn't hang you for being impure. They threw you off a rock. And if you were lucky, the fall killed you before the jagged ground finished the job. This wasn't reserved for criminals in the modern sense. Not thieves, not drunkards, not brawlers. This was for the cursed, the ritually tainted, the ones the city had decided were no longer safe to keep within its sacred boundaries. Maybe you killed someone, even accidentally. Maybe you violated a temple space, said the wrong words during the wrong festival, touched something that wasn't yours to touch. Maybe the gods were angry, and someone had to go, and your name just came up. It happened. The religious calendar was long. The list of offenses? Even longer. The most infamous of these places was the Barathron, a rocky chasm just outside Athens. It wasn't scenic. It wasn't solemn. It was just a hole in the ground, gaping and silent, where they dropped bodies deemed unworthy of touching sacred soil. No ceremony, no priest, no funeral chant, just the wind, the drop, and the fact that no one looked over the edge once it was done. If you were thrown into the Barathron, you didn't get a marker, you didn't get prayers, you got forgotten on purpose. And sometimes it wasn't even a cliff, just a wall, a tower. Any height tall enough to make survival unlikely and dignity impossible. The goal wasn't efficiency, it was distance. To remove you, to separate your taint from the city. It was legal exorcism by way of gravity. If your corpse shattered on impact, all the better. Less to clean up, less chance your polluted remains might contaminate something sacred. Because remember, in Greek religious thought, miasma wasn't just symbolic, it was contagious. A spiritual rot that clung to flesh, to houses, to entire communities. And it had to be cut off. And so the city did, not with pity, but with finality. There were no last meals, no final words. You were let out, sometimes in silence, sometimes jeered, bound, dragged, or simply escorted with enough force to make resistance laughable. And then, the edge. No railing, no hesitation. Just the hands that pushed and the moment after, when the city turned away and resumed its business because ritual cleansing waits for no one. This wasn't unique to Athens. Other city-states had their own cliffs, their own sacred laws, their own brutal definitions of what constituted a pollution too dangerous to tolerate. In Sparta, for example, weak or deformed infants were reportedly thrown into the apothetai, the deposits, a chasm at the base of Mount Taygetus, because the state couldn't afford sentimentality in a society built on military perfection. A crying child wasn't a tragedy. It was an inefficient investment. Better to let the rocks decide if the gods had approved the birth. But even in less extreme cases, the logic remained. If something threatens the spiritual health of the city, remove it. Don't argue. Don't delay. Just drop it out of sight and pray the gods are appeased. And here's the dark punchline. It worked. The city felt cleaner, safer, more righteous. No blood on the streets, no smoke in the air, just the quiet knowledge that someone once considered human had been edited out of the living landscape. Not with fire, not with blade, but with absence. You don't write a tragedy about the man thrown from the cliff. You don't name your son after him. You sweep the dust, bake the bread, and walk past the edge without looking down. Because in ancient Greece, some crimes weren't punished with pain. They were punished with void. Not all deaths in ancient Greece were local. Not all punishments came with the soft Athenian accent of polite democracy. Step beyond the boundaries of the polis, into the colonies, the borderlands, the war zones, the frontiers where the rules got dusty and the sunlight too direct. And you find a different tone entirely. One less obsessed with balance and ritual pollution, and more with raw, unblinking terror. Because when order frays at the edges of empire, justice is no longer about symbolism. It's about visibility, which is why some city-states and colonial governors, inspired perhaps by foreign custom or just good old-fashioned sadism, embraced a method that made even the gods avert their eyes. Crucifixion. Yes, we think of it as Roman, and they did perfect it, turn it into imperial policy and grim public theater. But the Greeks, especially in places where fear needed to travel faster than law, knew its power long before the Caesars got creative. Crucifixion in the Greek world was rare, but when it happened, it was meant to be remembered. It wasn't about killing. It was about sending a message across the hot, wind-blown landscape that said, "This could be you. There were no clean deaths here. No cups of poison. No sharp stones. Just wood, rope, nails, and the kind of afternoon heat that peeled the moisture from your skin before the blood had time to clot. You weren't killed quickly. You were tied or nailed to a wooden frame, sometimes a simple stake, sometimes a crossbeam, depending on how artistic the authorities felt that day, and then raised upright where everyone could see you, from a distance, from the road, from the market, from the temple. Steps. Your body became a warning sign. Your suffering a civic announcement. Betrayal has consequences. You died over hours, sometimes days, not from bleeding, although that happened, but from the slow breakdown of the body's ability to function. Muscles cramped. Breathing became shallow. The sun burned. The birds came. Flies settled. You lost feeling in your limbs, then in your mind. And all the while, you were on display, not just dying, but performing death for the benefit of a nervous, sunstruck audience. It wasn't always for major crimes. Banditry could earn you a stake. Rebellion, piracy, desertion. Anything that threatened the fragile illusion of control in a territory too far from home. It didn't matter if the trial was fair or if there'd been a trial at all. Crucifixion wasn't about law. It was about atmosphere, about making sure the next town overgot the message before the rumors faded and the blood dried. Sometimes the condemned were executed first, strangled, stabbed, clubbed, then hoisted up, their corpse stretched and nailed in place, left to rot as a monument to the state's reach. Other times they were still alive when the hammer fell. Those are the stories that lingered longer, the ones whispered over wine, the ones that made traitors lower their voices when discussing tax rates, or what really happened in that one border skirmish that no one seems to want to write down. And it wasn't confined to men. Women, too, could be crucified. Not often, not publicly, but enough that the fear extended beyond the battlefield and into the homes. Because a state that could hang your body on a wooden cross in the open air was a state that didn't need metaphors anymore. It could speak plainly, in shadows and screams. And in some cities, crucifixion wasn't even the worst. You might be exhibited while still breathing, locked in iron cages on the walls, suspended above the agora, starved, exposed, eaten slowly by time and the elements until your voice stopped carrying and your body stopped twitching. You didn't just die. You dissolved, piece by piece, a public artwork of decay. None of this was part of the core Athenian legal tradition. That's important to remember. The heart of Greece preferred its deaths cleaner, its meanings more symbolic. But even Athens, when scared, when pushed, when desperately tried to assert control over a world that refused to stay civil, would sometimes borrow a page from the outer provinces and nail its fears into wood. Because for all their talk of reason, the Greeks understood something very old and very true. Sometimes, nothing preserves order like the silhouette of a man dying slowly under the open sky. Not every death in ancient Greece came with speeches or symbolism. Some didn't even come with a reason that would make sense outside the fevered, goat-haunted mind of a city afraid of losing control. Because while philosophy carved its way through marble halls and democracy held noisy court in the agora, the everyday justice of the average polis, the kind handed out to the poor, the enslaved, the inconvenient, was far less poetic. It was fast, dirty, improvised, and often smelled like blood. And panic. The sentence might not be written down. The executioner might not have a title. But the end result was the same. You were dead, and someone else's anxiety had been soothed. Take flogging, for example. Whipping, lashing, scourging, whatever name you gave it, the idea was simple. Pain until silence. You might be lashed for theft, for disrespect, for touching something sacred with unclean hands, or simply because your master felt that justice could be measured in welts. If the lashing was done by the state, it might happen in the square, stripped to the waist, tied to a post, your back turned into a ledger of punishment. If you screamed, people listened. If you passed out, someone threw water. If you died, well, maybe you were weaker than expected. Lesson learned. Next. Then there was burning, rare but unforgettable, used when someone had committed a crime so offensive, so spiritually corrosive, that mere death wasn't enough. They had to be purged. Fire had religious weight. It cleansed, it sanctified, and it also destroyed evidence, which helped when the crowd didn't want to think too hard about what had just happened. The condemned might be tied to a stake, the wood piled high and dry, and the torch lit with solemn silence or noisy fervor, depending on who'd been insulted. It wasn't quick. Human bodies don't burn like dry twigs. They hiss, crack, blister, pop, and the smell, gods, the smell, lingered longer than the memory of the crime. And if you wanted to be quiet about it, there was drowning, often unofficial, often in secret, a sack, a rock, a boat pushed just far enough offshore. Sometimes the condemned were sewn into a bag. The Kekito Karisminos, the man bound by hands and sealed. If it was meant to be symbolic, it wasn't subtle. You weren't just silenced. You were erased. Your body vanished into the sea, into the rivers the gods were supposed to protect. Your spirit denied the dignity of land, stone, or fire. You didn't die in public. You disappeared. And that, in some cases, was the point. Then came the cages, brutal, humiliating, effective. You could be locked into an iron frame. Not hung, not crucified, just contained and left out in the sun day after day until the elements, the insects in your own failing body completed the sentence. You were not just punished. You were presented, left near city gates, near busy roads, near the agora, so that every passerby could look up and see what happens when the law decides you no longer qualify as human. You might last a day. You might last 3. You might go mad before your body gives out. You might be mistaken for a corpse, only to twitch in front of some unlucky baker delivering figs. There were no priests, no guards, just the cage, the sun, the flies, and your own breath turning against you. And it didn't have to be that formal. A slave who struck a citizen could be killed on the spot, with a rock, a blade, a boot. No trial, no appeal, just a shout and a crowd willing to say he had it coming. An accused sorcerer might be dragged through the streets, beaten with sticks, spat on, pelted with dung until they stopped moving. A woman suspected of infanticide might be bricked into a wall, her cries muffled, her name never written. A man accused of sacrilege might wake up bound to an altar the gods given his throat as an apology. Because for all their laws and courts and votes, the Greeks were still human. And human justice, under pressure, reverts to instinct, to spectacle, to vengeance wrapped in ritual and declared holy by the nearest bystander. There was no Geneva Convention, no appeals court, no last-minute stay. There was only the sentence, the crowd, and whatever method the city felt would most satisfy its anger that day. And the worst part? Half the time it worked. Not every execution in ancient Greece spilled blood. Not every sentence ended with rope or fire or a long tumble off a cliff. Some punishments killed slower. Not through flesh, but through silence, distance, and civic deletion. Because in a society that feared tyranny more than death and loved democracy almost as much as it loved a good grudge, Athens invented a punishment so uniquely cold, so elegantly cruel, that it could remove a man from the city without laying a single finger on him. They called it ostracism. And if crucifixion was pain made public, ostracism was oblivion made official. You weren't a murderer. You weren't a traitor. You weren't even necessarily guilty of anything. You were just too popular, too powerful, too present. Maybe you spoke too often in the assembly. Maybe you won too many battles. Maybe you had too many admirers. Or too much influence at the wrong symposium. You were a rising star, a man with momentum, and the city, paranoid, anxious, delicately balanced, decided it was safer if you simply weren't around for a while. 10 years to be precise. The process was perfectly legal, perfectly democratic, and perfectly designed to ruin your life without staining the marble. Once a year, the citizens of Athens could vote to hold an ostracism, not to ostracize a particular person. No, the first vote was simply on whether anyone needed to go this year. If the answer was yes, the wheels turned. Citizens gathered in the agora, broke pottery shards into little slips called ostraca, and scratched in the name of the person they thought should spend. The next decade enjoying the countryside without a vote, a voice, or an audience. 6,000 votes. That's what it took. Not proof, not evidence, just names on shards. And if yours came up often enough, that was it. No trial, no rebuttal, no closing arguments, just a civic nod, a tight smile, and instructions to pack your things. You had a few days to leave. You could take your money, your household, your dignity if it still fit in a satchel. But you had to go. 10 years. No exceptions, no early returns. And when you came back, if you came back, nothing had changed. Officially, you were still a citizen. No property confiscated. No laws rewritten. No public denouncement. You were simply, absent. The city had taken a breath without you, laughed without you, debated, voted, played its tragedies, launched its ships, and lit its altars while pretending you were never that important to begin with. Your name faded. Your influence shrank, and even if you were welcomed home, the space you used to, Phil had already been reshaped to accommodate your absence. It wasn't meant to be vindictive. Not officially. Ostracism was designed as a safety mechanism, a pressure valve for a society that had seen one too many would-be tyrants smiling too much in public. But it became something else, a weapon of jealousy, a tool of nervous consensus, a mirror in which the city saw not just potential danger, but its own insecurity. And in a way, that was the most Greek part of all. A punishment rooted not in what you did, but in how you made other people feel about the possibility of what you might become. And it wasn't just used on the corrupt. Aristides the Just was exiled because people were tired of hearing how just he was. Themistocles, the naval genius who helped save Athens, was cast out because he started believing his own press. Ostracism punished success, punished charisma, punished potential. It wasn't justice. It was preemptive regret. And while there were no chains, no scars, no smoke rising over the city walls, make no mistake, ostracism was a kind of death. A slow, social, erasing death. Your voice vanished from the assembly. Your face vanished from the feast. Your ideas, your allies, your political lineage, all frozen like a play paused in the middle of its third act. The audience went home, the lights stayed off, and you stood in the wings, waiting to matter again. Because in ancient Greece, sometimes the cruelest execution left the body intact and killed the legacy instead. And if death in ancient Greece was terrible, and it was, then what came after was worse, especially if your exit from the world had been hasty, shameful, or improperly notarized by ritual. Because the Greeks didn't just fear dying, they feared not being buried, not being mourned, not being remembered in the proper way, with the proper rites, by the proper people, at the proper time, in the proper location, facing the proper direction. The afterlife wasn't a paradise. It was an administrative state. And if you missed a single line on the form, a coin on the eyes, a libation at the tomb, a whispered name during the festival of the dead, your soul might never make it to where it was supposed to go. A good death wasn't about dignity. It was about procedure. Your body had to be retrieved, washed, anointed, wrapped. A coin placed under your tongue or on your eyelids. Payment for Sharon, the ferryman of the dead, who would otherwise leave you stranded on the banks of the Styx with nothing but regrets and the faint smell of garlic. You needed mourners, real or rented, to wail convincingly. You needed offerings, food, wine, oil, a lock of hair, maybe a token of whatever you'd done in life that wasn't completely forgettable. And you needed it all done soon. Delay, and the soul might get lost, forgotten, trapped in the mortal world, wandering, bitter, and possibly quite noisy at night. Failure to perform the rites wasn't just negligence. It was spiritual negligence, a crime against both the gods and the dead. It infected families, cursed households, disturbed the fields, made crops wither and children stammer. A body left unburied might bring misfortune on an entire district. An improperly buried criminal might cause a plague. An executed prisoner tossed into a ditch without ceremony? That was practically a beacon for divine wrath. This is why even in the harshest sentences, even for murderers, even for traitors, families beg for the right to reclaim the body. Not to forgive, not to deny, just to finish the process, to close the door between this world and the next, to ensure the dead went somewhere, anywhere, other than back into their dreams. There were laws, yes, but there were also exceptions. A mother could petition, a friend could bribe. A priest might be convinced that, yes, even this man deserved a proper grave. But if the request was denied, the consequences were chilling. You might be left to rot outside the city walls, unmarked, uncovered, devoured by dogs in time. Your name unspoken, your deeds unrecorded, no coin, no rights, no grave, just absence. The Greeks had a word for souls like that. Adaphoi, the unburied. They were feared, pitted, sometimes invoked during curses. These weren't the honored dead. These were the haunted, the inconvenient, the improperly deleted. And it wasn't just fear of ghosts. It was fear of oblivion. The Greeks didn't imagine heaven as a reward. Their afterlife, the asphodel fields, the gloomy meadows of the underworld, was gray, dull, forgetful. You weren't greeted with joy. You just faded slowly, quietly, unless someone above remembered you, remembered to offer, remembered to speak, because memory was the only anchor, the only thing that gave death direction. This is why heroes were so obsessed with legacy, why Achilles chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one, why soldiers screamed their names before charging, why poets wrote endlessly about names, lineages, bloodlines. To be forgotten was a second death, a deeper one, worse than the spear, worse than the sickness, worse than the fall from the cliff. Because once no one said your name, you were truly lost, irretrievably so. And so everything became about prevention. Parents drilled their children in the names of the ancestors. Tombs were carved with inscriptions, even when no one could afford the stone. Festivals like Anthesteria and Genesia were held just to feed the spirits, just to remind the dead that yes, they still mattered. Even the most modest graves had tokens, because you might be poor, you might be disgraced, but you didn't want to be forgotten. And yet, so many were criminals, slaves, foreigners, debtors. They died and vanished. No record, no coin, no grave, just bones in the soil or ashes scattered into the wind or silence thickening in the back of the temple. Their souls, if the priests were right, lingered, hovered, knocked on walls, called out during storms. You could hear them, maybe if you listened, or maybe that was just your guilt. Because in ancient Greece, the only thing worse than dying was dying wrong. So here you are, standing at the ragged edge of ancient Greek justice, not just as a citizen or a criminal or a spectator, but as something stranger, sadder, more universal, a mortal caught in a civilization that turned suffering into spectacle and law into literature. You've watched the stones fly. You've listened to the last breath rasp through poison-paralyzed lungs. You've seen the wind catch the tunic of a man moments before gravity replaced his name with silence. You've smelled the burning, felt the silence after the screams, noticed how quickly the crowds reassemble afterward, buying figs, arguing about taxes, complaining about how long the last execution took. Because death here isn't just a punishment, it's a performance, and everyone has a role to play. You see, in Greece, there is no division between law and theater. They're not opposites. They're twins, born in the same city, fed by the same festivals, wearing different masks. The courtroom is a stage. The agora is a chorus. The condemned is a character, written in blood, whose arc ends not in redemption, but in ritual silence. There are no curtains, no spotlights, no understudies, just the hot, dusty light of day, a crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, and the looming sense that justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. Because Greek justice wasn't private. It wasn't locked in chambers or signed behind doors. It was civic. It needed the crowd, not just to witness, but to absorb, to echo, to remember. A man didn't just die. He taught. His body, his fall, his stillness, all reminders. Don't insult the gods. Don't question the city. Don't rise too high. Don't speak too clearly. Don't be the person who gets remembered for the wrong reasons. The gods, of course, had their part. They didn't always intervene, but they loomed over everything. Their statues, their altars, their temples visible from nearly every execution site. Sometimes sacrifices were made to them before the killing. Sometimes after. Sometimes the whole thing was framed as a way to purify the city, to appease a divine wrath no one could quite explain. You might not believe the gods would strike you down, but you'd certainly notice when the priest frowned at your name. During an eclipse, and the audience, the real audience, wasn't the gods. It was the city, your neighbors, your friends, the people you once argued with in the assembly or nodded to at the olive stall. They came to see you end, to see the city confirm what they had whispered in the shadows, that you were too much, too proud, too dangerous, too different. They watched to feel safe again. Not because they loved justice, but because they hated uncertainty. Because your punishment wasn't about correcting you. It was about reassuring them. And even after it ended, after the smoke cleared, after the blood dried, after your name slipped into the same whispered sentences as other unfortunates, your role wasn't truly over. People would speak of you, argue about you, use you as a warning, a metaphor, a lesson for their sons. Maybe a tragedy would be written loosely based on your downfall. Maybe your name would be scratched into a stone, not as honor, but as caution. Or maybe not at all. Maybe you'd vanish so completely that future generations would step over your forgotten grave, praising the wisdom of the city that erased you without remembering why. Because that's the trick. Ancient Greece wasn't just a place of great ideas. It was a place where those ideas were tested on real bodies. Justice, order, balance. These weren't abstractions. They were exacted. Sometimes with words, sometimes with blades, and always with the unspoken understanding that everyone was watching and everyone could be next. And that's why you wouldn't last. Not just because of the pain or the rituals or the public cruelty, but because the line between citizen and symbol was too thin. One word too loud, one friend too powerful, one joke too clever. And suddenly you're no longer a man in a crowd. You're the next act, the next object lesson, the next body on a stone slab with people discussing whether your toes curled ironically. So yes, the Greeks gave us democracy, philosophy, architecture, and ethics. But they also gave us this. The city is theater, the law is performance, the crowd is judge, and the sentence is spectacle. And you? You're just one badly timed sentence away from joining the cast.